So you wanted to start with talking about the replicant situation?
Right. Well, so we had that Skype conversation not that long ago. I sent you that message where I was asking you, kind of when cyberpunk went from being hacker miscreants to being like whiny boys in their parents' basement, and your response was The Matrix, which I thought was kind of funny because, not to rag on The Matrix. The Wachowskis I thought made a pretty solid film that was fun. I saw it like 7 times in the movie theater when it first came out. We all know what happened as far as the sequels went, but the film itself, you're right, it kind of opened up almost a parody of what cyberpunk was, although The Matrix itself was supposed to be highly philosophical, which, that's debatable. The whole idea of these people running around inside of a computer program really felt like a watered-down version of what cyberpunk was really, supposed to be.
Yeah, and I responded to that question in like a heartbeat. And because I'd had the conversation before, and I was a huge fan of the original Matrix movie, and there were cool concepts in there, but yeah, heavily borrowed from all of the cyberpunk stuff that came before it. And I think part of the problem was, and why it stands as a transition from kind of gritty and sort of hyper real science fiction into what it is today, was for 2 reasons. First of all, the Wachowskis had distilled a lot of all of the cyberpunk tropes at that point into these like very simple personifications. Hot chicks in tight vinyl, and it was all like sunglasses at night, high action, and it was sort of devoid of the kind of commentary on the state of society, which, like you said, like there was the philosophical components were debatable, but they were present because it was kind of an indictment on the direction that America was taking in the 80s, which is, where cyberpunk was born.
Right.
And so it was an analysis and a sort of paranoid fever dream of the realization of things like Reaganomics and the proliferation of technology. And, the Wachowskis kind of abandoned that somewhat, not some of the paranoid parts. To be fair, they tried to incorporate that, but they did such a poor job with the engineer at the end of the second movie that it was pointless. It was awful. But
yeah, the engineer ended up being just this. It was almost like they were talking directly at you, and they went and read a bunch of introduction to philosophy books and tried to ram every single concept imaginable into that monologue. And that's kind of, the second movie was the first movie, just bigger to begin with. And by the time you hit that point, I think that's where it truly jumped the shark, for the entire series.
Yeah, no, truly. And it almost feels like, the first one was a success, which probably, maybe they weren't banking on it. A lot of movies were coming out in the late 90s that were focused on the new popularity of the internet and cyber culture, because Strange Days was another movie among many that were kind of exploring the concept of what will this new era of a digital culture look like. And Strange Days,
fantastic movie, by the way.
Phenomenal movie. And it didn't have the impact that The Matrix did. So maybe, around the time The Matrix was coming out, they just didn't expect it to be so big, so they didn't have a plan for a sequel. So when they did a sequel, they said, well, let's just do everything that the first one did, but like you said, bigger and better and more pedantic. And it was really obnoxious. Absolutely. I remember as soon as I came home from, seeing it the first time, I had to go online and see if anyone had already sort of like done a breakdown of what the fuck he said. Because I consider myself a smart guy, and I could not follow what he was saying. It was deliberately hyper cerebral, and it was unnecessary. And that was the thing. So it was a combination of, the explosion of the internet, and it being accessible to everybody, not just some thing like Prodigy, like what is Prodigy? Now is a real thing that everyone was getting on. People were starting to buy things online, and so all of this stuff started to culminate, but then the popularity of The Matrix really, I think, shed a lot of the other nuanced stuff that made cyberpunk so interesting and just made it about, people with computers fighting in digital land. And that's pretty much where it ended.
Yeah, it's like the Matrix essentially is the hot topic of cyberpunk.
100%.
This kind of faux image that nobody ever digs even further into to find out the true sources of, where that philosophy came from or where those tropes came from. But definitely hot topic.
Oh my God, it's the perfect analogy. It really is, and because around that time too, a lot of music, there's a lot of electronic music that was getting its day in the sun in terms of the mainstream. A lot of industrial. Nine Inch Nails, became really popular in the mid '90s. So by the time the Matrix came around a few years later, people were kind of primed and ready for this like interesting underground taste of things. Like, oh, this is interesting to people who wear leather and vinyl and sunglasses at night, And I remember, people coming up to me because Nine Inch Nails had that one popular song, Closer, but nobody knew what the name of the song was. They just knew it was,
They knew the refrain. Yeah,
right. They knew the refrain, which had profanity in it, and that's what they thought the name of the song was. And again, it was like there was no interest to dig deeper, and that was sort of the problem with cyberpunk. And the culture at the time was there was a lot of surface level stuff that had some appeal, but it was like the tip of the iceberg. And all the stuff that was under the water, the bulk of the iceberg, nobody cared about. And that's when cyberpunk died, was, in the late 90s around that time, because it went to the mainstream and nobody really cared about whatever the deeper message was, the criticism on consumerism or corporatism in America. It was just cool people wearing cool clothes shooting each other.
Yeah.
And it breaks my heart.
It's funny because it reminds me, like, everybody thought it was, all this coolness, everybody thought it was cool. Fascinatingly enough, I came across, there was a Medium post, but it was actually from a guy that we know from, back during the Key 23 days online. And he goes by the moniker Mikey, but he uses like that leap speak, whatever, where, the I is a 1 and then like the E is a 3 or whatever. And he had made that post where he was kind of like, hey guys, cyberpunk was supposed to be a warning. And, it's probably the third time he's posted on a different, I think it went up on Technical first. I can't remember. And then he had posted on a personal site, and then he put it up on Medium. But that's absolutely, the pieces of the Matrix that people fall in love with, that's all of the surface level, the shininess, and you don't see below that to see that there were actually messages in cyberpunk that were warnings of this is what happens when corporatism goes too far. This is what happens when technology goes too far, when crime goes too far, when things are left unchecked. And, they lump the Matrix into, the cyberpunk movies and into the cyberpunk genre. And you and I are probably in agreement where the best cyberpunk film of all time has to be Blade Runner. Yeah. For almost every reason imaginable. I watched it again a couple of months ago. Heather had family down, and I turned it on, and it was on Amazon, and I watched it off of Amazon, and I was just simply amazed at how well everything in the film held up, including the cinematography. It was like they could just release that in theaters today, and it wouldn't miss a beat. It was amazing what they actually did with that film. Yeah. No, I agree. And what's funny is actually, I was trying to remember the names of the replicants earlier today. Right. And I was like, and I wasn't remembering Zora. Because remember, like, Roy, Leon, Zora, and Triss. And so, anyway, I found out that there's a theater playing the original Blade Runner here in Philly. And so it was kind of cool. I was like, oh, yeah, there's a place called the Roxy, and they just play a lot of old movies and stuff. And they're playing Blade Runner today. I was like, oh, man, I might have to go see Blade Runner. Although I did see it in the theater when Ridley Scott re-released what he called the final cut. Right. It was nice because that was the first time I got a chance to see it in the theater, so that was really awesome. Right. I wish they would do. So there's the Alamo Draft House that's in our area. They have one up in Kernstown, which is about an hour from me, and they're building one in Charlottesville, not that far from UVA, and they have recliners. They serve food and they serve beer there. And sometimes they do a lot of specialty cinema. So we had gone and seen The Dark Crystal there because it was like the summer of, it was like the 80s. So they did one film each week that was the top box office, I guess, receipt of that week during the year, and that it came out back then. So we went up to see that, and I would love to see, something like something like Blade Runner in the Alamo Draft House, and just, kick back and have some craft beer.
Yeah, man. Do they take suggestions? Can you be like, hey, man, get Blade Runner?
I'm gonna look into that because
that'd be awesome.
They wouldn't, right?
One of the most amazing things you said, how Blade Runner stands the test of time, and it does on many levels, but is a controversy that still rages today, which is whether or not Deckard was a replicant. Which I feel like, if anyone's familiar with the movie, they're going to be aware of that controversy.
Right.
And it has sort of, I used to get pretty fired up about it, and then Ridley Scott released his final cut, where he went back and added some certain touches to emphasize his point that he made the movie in mind with Deckard being a replicant.
Right.
And I just don't. Now, I respect his artistic vision, and if that's how he posits it, then I accept it. But it doesn't make sense for me. It just doesn't make sense in terms of, and the movie was also sort of well known for having a lot of inconsistencies that they did fix in the final cut. I mean, they put a lot of effort into it, but some stuff, just like, they mentioned more replicants than there actually were in the movie escaping. So there's a lot of like little holes and stuff, and the production of the movie, it's also well known, is pretty rough. But we know for a fact that the source material, Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, he was not a replicant. He was not a replicant in the original.
Right, and obviously the source material. I mean, Dick's work does get adapted quite frequently, but nobody stays true to the source material because of obviously the way that he writes. It doesn't translate well into movies, word for word or scene for scene. So liberties are taken. Obviously, the story is not an exact. An exact frame for frame when you get to the movie itself. So, but we will throw out there that source material, Deckard was not a replicant.
No, he wasn't.
And then was it the writer or was it the co-producer? I know somebody who was involved with the actual construction of the original story. I could have swore they had said that they purposely left that open-ended and a decision wasn't made either way, and they were trying to leave it up to the viewers to decide whether or not he was a replicant.
Well, Scott had said that early on, like, in throughout the 90s and the early aughts and stuff, before he released that final cut, he was saying, like, I know what I think, but it's deliberately left open so that the viewer can interpret it so that they have a more personal relationship with the movie. So that's what people did. Now, of course, I'm in the camp of Deckard is human. And he's human for a couple reasons to me. The first one is that the audience coming into an alien world, you need a relatable protagonist. So, and that doesn't mean that the protagonist has to be identical to the viewer, but it doesn't make it easier in a world that is so strange that you've got that relatability on the level of it's about humans versus machines.
Right.
So,
and Blade Runner came out prior to the trend towards some sort of shock twist ending. So it's not like this is something thrown in to make you think, and that's why it was written. Those things came later in cinema. Traditional cinema during this time, you had a protagonist who was your window into that world. Right.
And so it makes really just right on the top level of it, it makes the most sense to have a human protagonist, especially one whose job is to hunt replicants. So it wouldn't even make sense. One of the it wouldn't make sense for Tyrell to insert a replicant to do the job of hunting replicants. I mean, there's a sort of cynical irony, but the movie wasn't that cynical. I mean, it wasn't. The mood wasn't like all of this kind of these plot twists and stuff. And, again, him possibly being a replicant is the biggest twist in the movie. But and certainly there's a lot of symbolism, and it was a very, thinking man science fiction, but it wasn't cynical, I wouldn't say. And to have a cop in there to either fool the humans, because, there's no clues given as to did the department know that if he was a replicant, did the department know? Were they in on it? If they weren't, then the Tyrell Corporation is basically, scamming the police department with this cop to kill other replicants.
He was also weaker. He was weaker than the replicants.
He was weaker, slower.
So why would this be your replicant hunter, and why would you limit him unless you were doing some sort of psychological experiment or some sort of scientific experiment where you were trying to see how close to a human you could get a replicant. But even then, why do that?
Right.
Not the point of the replicants.
So I actually wrote a couple notes, and I'm gonna kind of go down. We kind of touched on some of them. The first part is, to me, other than again, just kind of having him in there to be a cop hunting replicants and being cynical, he was a highly regarded Blade Runner. In the beginning, you have I forget the guy's name now, but he spoiler alert. Gets shot by a replicant because he's using the Voight-Kampff machine to find these replicants that escaped. And so they pull in Deckard out of retirement. They say, you were the best. You had the magic. And he's really kind of get him all worked up to kind of bring him back to the force. And Deckard was so jaded with the job. Maybe he was the best. Now he's retired. Well, by the time Deckard became that well-known of a Blade Runner and then retired, it's only at that point in the movie that they introduce Deckard to Rachel, which is Tyrell's prototype, who doesn't know that she's a replicant, and we have to infer that this is a new thing. Well, and Tyrell kind of says it, that this is a new thing we're doing to try and control the replicants by giving them memories.
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff that happens in this movie that's sort of new in the world of replicants that would have had to have happened to Deckard already, years prior. And if they don't have a 4-year lifespan, what's the timeline? The timeline never made sense to me to have all this stuff happen. So Deckard is an accomplished Blade Runner, then something happens where he's sick of the job, then he retires. It would have had to have been less than 3 years, right? And so what's the process for Tyrell? What are they just cranking out replicants and then walking some stranger up to the door of the police station and saying, hey, we got this guy, he'll be a great Blade Runner. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're hired. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
there's an indication of a lifetime of experience required to get this guy into that place where we find him in the movie.
Right. His entire, not just his memories, but his history, everything would have to be false, and all of the people in his life that know him would have to be in on it.
Yeah.
And that's just, that's asking too much.
And like you had said, he wasn't very strong. I mean, in every encounter with all of the replicants, they all whip his butt. All of them. Yeah. Every single one, even the pleasure bot, right? Yep. Daryl Hannah's bot beats him up. So he's not very strong. In many cases in the movie, they indicate he's drinking. Now, I don't want to infer that he's got a drinking problem, but he drinks a lot. Okay, so you got a robot who's not strong, gets beat up by all the other androids or the replicants, drinks an awful lot. It's like, but then of course Tyrell's worried about putting memories in the replicants to better control them. But you made this one and you make him drink, which I don't know. I can't imagine that actually assists in controlling them.
Right, and part of the movie, I mean, this whole idea is man versus machine, or man versus this new entity, and in the end, it was about what does it mean to be human,
right?
And Rutger Hauer's character clearly shows in the end, he takes the high road. He shows Deckard almost what it's like to, what it means to be human, because Deckard is on his way out. He is drinking. He is, a down on his luck style cop, beaten by the world.
Definitely noir.
Virtually left, no hope left in humanity in his own eyes, and Rutger Hauer shows him something different.
Right.
Something more. And so to then turn Deckard into a replicant, it kind of ruins some of the overall themes of the story.
It does, especially, and you hit the nail on the head with the dynamic there at the very end. Because Batty has established that he doesn't not kill because he's, afraid to kill or can't kill. He kills Tyrell.
Right.
He gouges his eyeballs out and leaves them there. And I love that, in the sort of making of notes, they shot the scene where Rutger Hauer, Roy Batty, is now he's descending from the top of Tyrell Tower after having just killed Tyrell, and he's going through these range of emotions. And they said they wanted to capture this almost sort of like childlike discovery of, I just did something bad. Because again, he's only 4 years old. And so there's a range of emotions that he hasn't had a lifetime to master. like humans have. I just thought it was really neat. So they showed these different sort of scenes where he goes through these. He's mugging it, but he's trying to figure out the right way to express. This thing I just did is terrible, and I feel bad, but emotions. So it's really neat. So then and you kind of want to wonder, like, so has that led Batty in the end to understand the need for forgiveness? And that's what he does with Deckard.
Right.
And you're right. And that dynamic between being a machine, being, an android that realizes that your time has come and there's nothing you can do about it, but you can still be forgiving in the face of death. If Deckard was also a replicant, it makes it a moot point. Especially when Deckard's running away, getting beat up, getting drunk. I mean, and those are all human traits to overcome to become a hero. Like being a coward, being weak, being an alcoholic. That's part of a character arc to overcome, and that is how the protagonist will become a hero, right? Very interesting that it's the antagonist who shows our hero how to be a hero in a way. But I agree with you. It really, really muddies the water from a very nice, clean package of storytelling if he's an android, Deckard.
I agree. And it's funny because we talk a lot about cyberpunk. I mean, you and I are both into the Netrunner game, and I guess I'm assuming it probably stems from our upbringing. I mean, I remember my first computer was a Commodore 64. And I had a data set, which has nothing to do with programming, but it was a tape recorder that you stored data on. I mean, and back then floppy disks were still floppy, and you were programming in BASIC, and it was just this weird green screen machine that you tried to play games on, and you tried to echo commands and echo text back at yourself. At a time when most people didn't have computers, didn't even know what to do with them, and I kind of transitioned from that. We ended up with dial-up internet where it was AOL, but it was like the AOL that you had to install this massive thing on your system that ate up all of your hard drive space because there was all these different chat rooms and or whatever they called their special rooms, and so you got to play with that for about 3 months before you uninstalled it, and you got Prodigy in order to get online. And I remember setting up my own Gopher server and, using the Usenet news groups. I mean, now you only have the HTTP protocol. There's really none of these other protocols that are out there anymore. People barely even use FTP anymore.
Yeah. At work, they mocked the fact that I was trying to set up a virtual machine and I wanted to publish to the virtual machine in Azure with FTP from Visual Studio. And they're like, who even uses FTP anymore? I'm like, I mean, it works. I guess.
Right. I mean, they don't even open up those ports anymore. At my job, you have to use SSH or you use SFTP in order to go over SSH, just to get your files on there. But it just cracks me up because, who sets up a Gopher server nowadays? Those things just don't exist anymore. And I mean, Usenet news groups used to be where you had to hang out, to hear spoilers on your favorite television shows. And of course, any chat room you went into, there's always some guy that jumps in there and is like, okay, please put your male, female /age so that you can get,
Oh, man.
So that guy's always in the chat rooms trying to figure out, how old the girls are in the chat room, I guess. And I know you have an interesting story about when you were younger and in the 80s, and I don't know how much you can tell about it without somebody showing up at your door and arresting you. But if there's anything you can you can say, go ahead, because I know this was always fun to talk about. When we used to work together. Yeah, no,
I think I'm outside the statute of limitations now.
As you would hope.
Yeah, right. No, because it's funny. You mentioned like when you were younger and you had the computers, and I didn't really, my mom couldn't afford computers, so I kind of got my start with phones, just hacking phones. It's called phone phreaking, and that was actually really interesting to me because it allowed me to get close to the technology and the world of the sort of science fiction world of science fiction, the science fiction that I was into. But in a way that was kind of cost-free to me. But, I mean, BBSs were my thing, and that was usually from a friend's house. I never got into the AOL chat rooms thing.
They were horrible. Good for you.
Yeah. I mean, I saw friends in them. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I knew what they were, certainly. I knew people would spend all night talking on them. But my thing was, getting into those phone systems. There was things called, I'm trying to remember the names of things now. But it's just so funny how certain stuff slips from your memory. But you basically they were like chat rooms, like party chat rooms. I mean, it used to be back in the days when people actually used their phones for more than just like, bringing up the web, like smartphones. You would actually call party lines and sit and talk to people all night. I never got into that either, not from a normal phone. But I would do it.
Commercials, though.
Yeah, and I would do it. I would basically hack into people's phones, or what we would do is we would open up those big metal boxes that the phone company used, and there were all these studs. You have two studs. You can hook alligator clips. You can make your own lineman's phone. Those big phones that you see the lineman carry. You can make your own. You would strip the wires and take alligator clips on either wire, and it would just be those like little, home phones that you have, right, in the cradles.
Right.
Clip the wires onto the studs, the screws, and you're basically on someone's line. And so that's when we would, just call whatever numbers, and not whatever numbers, like not those party lines, but we would call special numbers the phone company used they're called bridges. That's what they're called. I was trying to think of the name. That's why I'm stuttering. But we would call these bridges, and other hackers and other phone freaks will be on those bridges because certain numbers would be circulated on BBSs saying, this is where everyone's hanging out Friday night, and they would exchange information like PBX branch exchanges and stuff where you could hack into PBXs, basically dial into a private branch exchange, which is like a corporate phone thing, and then from there you could dial out anywhere. So there's so many different ways to get into the phone system and make free phone calls, and just discovering that was a lot of fun. But I did get in trouble for it eventually, so I kind of stopped because I just figured the government was on to me. I mean, my house was raided by the FBI, and this was by that point. By this time, it's like the mid '90s, and there's not much of a story to tell at this point. But other than I was out, I had a lot of my equipment on me, just because again, if we ever needed to make a call, beepers were still the thing back then. So somebody paged us.
Right, pagers.
Yeah, somebody paged us. We would just find a box, open the box, and make our call. And yes, that cost was being put on somebody else, and I acknowledge that. But, I was a teenager, and or no, I wasn't even a teenager at that point. Was I? 15, 16, 17? Yeah, I was. But, that's how we kind of did it. And it was a weird thing. The cops pulled us over for some unrelated thing, and then a bunch of cops swarmed us, and I wound up getting, they found all this equipment on me. And some of it was illegally obtained because I would go to hacker. I went to one of the earliest hackers on planet Earth, New York, and you could get your hands on a lot of equipment there. And I didn't care if it was illegal or not. I wanted it because it was awesome. And I've always been a bit of a gadget freak. And so the cops pulled us over, and I got arrested, and they handed over all my gear to the FBI. And then the FBI came to my place, took all my stuff. I did manage to sneak out a floppy disk that I stupidly logged all of my hacking and phone freaking exploits on. I managed to slip that out without anybody noticing, so they didn't take that, because that would be the only piece of incriminating evidence. They took my computer. Ironically, they took everything. They took all kinds of weird stuff. And yes, it's true. If you've ever heard weird rumors that you think were just wives' tales, they do contemplate. They actually almost considered taking my radio and my alarm clock because it was plugged into the wall. They seriously were going to do it. But what? Oddly enough, I called the Department of Defense because I had heard that if you called up and you told them that you were part of some corporation and that you're looking to follow government guidelines and best practices on network security, they would send you these books called the Rainbow Books. They're sort of famous for that among the hacker community back then. And in fact, they did. They sent me this big box for free, a box just showed up one day with all these Department of Defense network security books. And I couldn't understand any of it, but I had, sort of bragging rights to it. And the FBI just glazed right over it. They didn't even look at it. And it's got the official seal on the spine, all these, maybe about an inch thick. Some are a couple inches thick. I mean, this is a big box of books, and they completely ignored it. Which, if anything, just think about that. They were concerned that my alarm clock is plugged into my wall. Completely missed the fact that I've got this big library of books from the Department of Defense. Didn't even bother. Mind blowing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I did not go to jail, by the way. Yeah, so that's kind of. But, the great thing is now that being in a field of technology, and we're in the same field, we're both developers, and I'm legit, it's actually really awesome to kind of be in a world where, you kind of have this flexibility to kind of explore things now. Like when I was younger, I did those illegal things because it was the only way I had access to stuff. That was, it wasn't like because I wanted to be bad or get into trouble. It's just I couldn't afford a computer, so hacking phones was the cheapest, most abundantly available technology for me to play with. So that's what I did. And now we have so much open source, free stuff that you can just learn on your own, and you don't have to worry about the FBI come knocking. It's great.
Right. I mean, we've entered into a day and age where Microsoft is open sourcing technology left and right, which would have been unheard of. I mean, this is the company that even today some people will post on Twitter or on whatever their choice of dispensing complaints is with a MS, but the S being a $, which always annoyed me. I started off in the Java world. Well, I actually started off with Perl, and I built an online website that sold games when you had to type in online bookstore in Alta Vista because Google wasn't even a thing yet in order to get at Amazon. And I used to send Amazon cash. That's how new of a company they were. I would order a book and then I would send them cash, and they would freaking send me the book, and I would do that. I mean, for a couple of years before finally they were like, please don't send cash anymore. And so, you start off doing, building websites like that. And then next thing you know, I'm into Perl, and then I'm into some JavaScript before there were JavaScript libraries. And then eventually I started programming in Java, and then I was brought up, to a division of AIG, to work for them for a while before, I got into .NET. And, I got into .NET pretty early, C# code. And it's been interesting to see how C# has evolved over the years. And originally it was a Java clone with better XML libraries. It was the most efficient way to talk about it, because XML was a big thing at the time that .NET came out. And Java, you had a bunch of add-on libraries, and there were many different ones, and they didn't all work the same, and they didn't all work well, and Java was known for being slow. And Microsoft basically built C# from the ground up to be about XML with, a lot of improvements on Java. And, we've seen it evolve over the years into, ASP.NET, ASP.NET MVC, all of the different entity things. And, even today with C# 7 coming out, actually with the most recent release, and then C# 7, you get to see all the different changes over the years. And there's one change in particular that I know makes a couple of people angry. It makes me angry, and it might even make you angry too. And that's the var keyword. And anytime I see it, I cringe a little bit, because it reminds me of old school JavaScript, where all you had was a var keyword, and you didn't have any, static typing. And I know we've gotten into a discussion about this before, because actually we use it in a way that is not with a lot of the best practices that's suggested, including Microsoft's best practices, because they claim that the benefits of using var are stuff like it makes you name your variables better. It's better for API creation. It removes code noise, and obviously they want to use it in such a way where if the type can be inferred by looking at the code, then you shouldn't have to be explicit with the type. And I find that kind of ridiculous, because I look at it from a utility perspective. I like static typing because I've had to deal with things like JavaScript. So if I'm writing code and something's an integer, I'm going to put int on the front of it.
Right.
If it's a string, I'm going to declare it a string. I don't feel the need to declare a var because, one, I'm a little bit old school, but two, to me, it kind of defeats the purpose of the usage of that. Because if I'm creating a string, I know it's a string. I need to know it's a string. If I'm creating an integer, I know it's an integer. I need to know it's an integer because I'm using those things. Where I find that I use var most often is after making database selections. usually with entity things, because I don't actually need to know the type of the thing that's returned, because a lot of times what's being returned is a collection of generics. So I'll give you an example. We use a lot of so if you have your DB context and you DB context.database.SQL query, which accepts the generic, you can basically create your model. Let's say it's a people model from a people table, and your generic, that's the generic that you pass into this, and then you pass in your select statement. So you got your raw SQL that you're then, passing to the database. And with the newer versions of Entity, after that execution, because you've passed in the generic of whatever your model was, it auto maps it for you. That actually returns, I think it's called a DB SQL raw or something. I don't need to know that. Right. Because that's not actually what I'm using. So when I get that variable back, or when I get that data back, what I usually end up doing is using the entity classes or the entity methods coming off of that. So you're either taking first or default, or it's an IEnumerable. You're passing it back to something that's expecting an IEnumerable, and then you're listing that, or you're iterating over that. Because at the end of the day, when you're using entity, what you care about is those ORMs. You care about the model classes. Right, the mapping. And those are the types that you're looking at. You don't care. So in that instance, I'll use var, because it's the var. It's not the type of the variable that I care about. It's the usage of it after I've executed that query. And I don't know. I know you have thoughts on this too. So let me get your opinion. And then I actually have a couple of notes, because I did look up this debate online, and it seems like we're not the only ones that have a problem with the usage of var. And there's a lot of key points that some other people bring up as to why you shouldn't use var and you should use your normal static typing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's type safety, first of all, right? Like, we want to make sure that we know, first of all, like you said, if we know what kind of value we're passing to a field, we know what that field is, then make it a type of that field. Then we know what it is. There's no reason to be ambiguous. And I was, this is a project I was working on recently, and when Microsoft says that, if use a var if you are initializing your variable, and you can, like you said, infer it from that statement. But if not, right, if you're going to not initialize your newly declared field or whatever it's going to be, then, strongly type it. Well, I think it's best to just get in the habit of strongly typing it. If you know what it's going to be, and there's really no reason to be ambiguous about it, then strongly type it. And I just like to be in the habit of it. And writing a lot of JavaScript, you sort of get used to just slapping all your variables in vars, because that's all you've got, unless you're using something like TypeScript, right, which is recommended. But I had written I was declaring a bunch of objects that I was using in an MVC project, and then some third party we were working with, a vendor, they went back and rewrote all my code and just changed all of my strongly typed variables, all my strongly typed objects, to var. And I was kind of pissed off. I was like, well, there's no, and don't build, and the thing that makes me mad is, of course, we had to pay for them to go back and just sort of like, loosely type my stuff. Whether or not it's a preference, that work was done. That was unnecessary. That's maybe just me being gripey. But
no. In fact, it's funny, because I remember you telling me that story, and that was one of the things that I kind of struck me, was that your company is basically paying this person. You're paying them to do work. You're not paying them to rewrite things. And what this developer did added no value to what you were doing. And it's really funny, because I had just posted that 10 Commandments of Egoless Programming up on the blog, which comes from Weinstein. And one of the 10 Commandments is, don't rewrite code without consultation. And the idea behind it is basically there's a major difference between refactoring code and rewriting it.
Right.
You should always strive to make code better, but don't rewrite code just to rewrite it or to make it your own. And that developer seemed to be doing something in order to make it their own. And one of the major complaints about the use of var is that all of the benefits, or mostly all of the benefits, seem to be stylistic or cosmetic. There's no actually value to the code in and of itself for using it. And there's a lot of contradiction in what it tries to say that there are benefits. Like it says it induces better naming of local variables. What does that even mean? Well, what that means is that you're creating a variable, and now instead of being like int whatever I need the int to be, a lot of times I end up having to go back and you would have to go back, and it's just like with JavaScript or dynamically typed languages. A lot of them you'll end up using a Hungarian style of notation. So even when remember the old days where you used to use data table DT, people equals new data table, or data row DR. You prefix. You end up prefixing your variables with the type. And I've noticed that a lot of the var usage, people end up having to do the same thing, because if they don't, then they lose track of what that variable actually was.
Which is ironic.
Right. It reduces readability, a lot, in my opinion.
No, I totally, and that was one of the things. That's why you try and get in the habit of making things readable. And not that this has much to do with the VAR thing, but even in the naming conventions, I've long since moved past, if you remember the days where we tried to do our own compression on naming,
right.
Like we would drop all the vowels and make it as short as possible. I'm way past that. My variables are basically typed words, and they'll be sometimes, I try not to make them too long, but they try to be descriptive of what the thing is, what kind of, value is being contained in the variable or the field. But again, I just try to stay in the habit of, my best practice is to strongly type this stuff so I don't get confused when I'm reading things.
Yeah, and there's a really good blog post that I found, and it's Brad Smith's coding blog, and he talks about this. And I'll put the link in the show notes for when we post this. And what he has is, and this is a paragraph I'm going to read for you. He says, the purpose of var, for those who don't know, is to omit the type name when declaring a local variable in situations where the type name is unknown, unavailable, or doesn't exist at the point where the code is written. The primary case where this is true is for anonymous types whose type name is provided at compile time. It is also used in LINQ, which is kind of what we were discussing earlier about with entity models, where the result of a query cannot easily be inferred by the programmer, perhaps because it uses group structures, nested generic types, or anonymous types as well. And he talks about there seems to be a tendency for programmers nowadays, ones who do not or who are new to C# for the most part, to use var for almost every variable declaration. And it's interesting that he's got a quote here from an MSDN, article where it talks about implicitly typed local variables, and it says the use of var does have at least the potential to make your code more difficult to understand for other developers. For that reason, the C# documentation generally uses var only when it is required, which just cracks me up, because the whole the whole point of programming, a lot of times they tell you to write for the next developer, program for the next developer.
Yeah.
You want to create your code in such a way that somebody else who comes after you can read it. Otherwise, you just end up with this unmaintainable project. And Microsoft right there is admitting that, hey, we basically threw you guys a bone by giving you var because people were probably clamoring for it, or we got a couple of JavaScript developers who were working on the C# spec for some odd reason, and they decided to throw it in there. However, please note that this could actually cause more problems than it can solve. That's kind of what I get from that.
Right.
And he lists several areas where it has an issue, and he talks about implicitly typed variables lose their descriptiveness. That's part of what we're talking about with the Hungarian notation. You end up actually either you don't know what the variable is when it's when it has var, or you end up having to put int or string or s or whatever. You end up putting the type in with the variable name. He talks about specificity versus context, increased reliance on IntelliSense. That's another thing that we often take for granted because we use Visual Studio, but with IntelliSense you can certainly determine the type, but now you're reliant on that IntelliSense all the time. And he talks about no backwards compatibility because, obviously var is a new keyword. So if you try to run that for some reason, if you have a library that you need to recompile down to something else, and I ran into this issue not that long ago where I had to take a 4.5 project and I only had to go down to 4.0, luckily. So most of it was still backwards compatible, but if you took a library, you took a piece of code that for some reason needed to target another system, the use of var obviously is not going to work.
Right.
I'm not too concerned with that one because obviously there's a lot of stuff that breaks when you try to go for backwards compatibility.
Right.
But he makes a lot of good points on the reasons why VAR is just a bad practice.
Yeah, and I will say a case where I've used VAR recently, and I do use VAR, where I was trying to pull in some data from an object and from a database, and I built an object from a database, an entity, and the object was pulling the data, and I wasn't quite sure of all of the data I was pulling in, so I'm trying to strongly type. I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm going to pull in, let's just say a string. I don't remember specifically what it was, but it was like, no, this thing won't come in, and it's telling me the object type or the field type. And I'm like, okay, well, I give it that strong type, and it's still rejecting it. I'm like, sometimes it is easier when you're like getting conflicting messages, and it does happen. The compiler doesn't seem to want to take anything you're strongly typing, and a VAR works. Like, okay, well, VAR, just great, your generic container. I have used it like that, but again, it's one of those things where I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to deal with this, especially not stuff I've written. But if I'm trying to write code around other stuff other people have written, yeah, I'll just grab a VAR and I'll put it in there. Nothing else works.
Right.
But that's why VAR is great.
But you would hope that the person who's actually, and this goes back to new developers, if they're just littering their code with VAR, they're losing a sense of understanding of what the code should be and how code should be built and how patterns should work. And I hate to rag on new developers, although I'm sure in other episodes I'll do it quite frequently. But there's a problem when you hitch your wagon onto something new and you just run with it, and VAR is one of those things that can muddy the waters, substantially. And it's funny because here you have C# statically typed, in which they're introducing VAR, which is not dynamic typing, but it's at least implicit typing, so that you can have some more flexibility. But on the other end, you have Microsoft creating TypeScript, in which they're taking, a language like that and they're adding static typing to it. Now you can choose not to add the type decorations, and you can choose to just use var, just use let, and not use any of, and not claim anything's a string, or only do it when you explicitly need to know what that, complex type or what that return type is. But those are two different directions, really. One's striving to be almost more dynamic, and the other one's now striving to be a little more static. So I guess it's just a case of a large company with a lot of different people trying to accomplish a lot of different things at once.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel kind of strongly enough about it that it seems to me like it shouldn't be up to a matter of personal preference, because there is a matter of best practices. But it's certainly not anything I would ever get into a strong debate about, because it's kind of tough to tell people when the convenience is there. It's just there's a lot of points that are made strongly on both sides. I just I stand firmly on my side, and that's fine. That happens a lot.
It's certainly not worth sitting there and rewriting somebody's code and checking that back into the source control.
Absolutely not.
Say, I changed this because I'm now doing it the right way, unlike the way that it was.
Yeah, like that really irked me. Like, come on, man. But whatever.
Yeah, it was a low blow, and it was not. And then they got paid for it. So
that's the thing, right? Like you said,
injury. As
a matter of just practical functionality, nothing was broken. They just saw something done in a way that they didn't like. And again, Microsoft declares it best practice to declare var where you can, otherwise infer it from initialization. I think you should strongly type it all the time, as much as possible. Whatever. So, but again, when it gets down to now, you're getting paid to just kind of not even refactor but rewrite. That's obnoxious.
Right. Absolutely.